And then, e poi?
And then we were all sitting together, me and Sophie were sitting together, Sophie was very, very upset. Amanda was just waiting, standing against the wall while we were waiting. And we were all, I was talking to Sophie quietly.
Anche noi in casa. Sophie was always sad. She was really...
Yeah, Sophie was
Sophie era quella, diciamo, che proprio veramente non riusciva a riprendersi, abbastanza
yeah, so I sat with Sophie
provata.
Talking quietly with Sophie, just calming her down. And then she shouted out, and she shouted, "Those fucking bastards."
She shouted.
Loudly, looked up and shouted loudly.
Così all'improvviso. She said,
"Those fucking bastards."
Ha detto, quei maledetti bastardi.
Sì, come devi dire quello che...
Loro cosa hanno pensato?
And what did you think about this?
Both me and Sophie looked at each other because I noticed that she said plural instead of just a singular person.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, thoughts build up until...
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. That was the voice of Samantha Rodenhurst giving her deposition on the 31st of January 2008, around about 3 months after the incident. Put up your hand if you feel like the drug narrative is overblown in the Knox case. Anyone feel that way? Put up your hand if you've said or written that there's no harm in using marijuana and that's what this case is all about, and marijuana doesn't lead to violent impulses. Anyone here that has made a comment like that? Put up your hand. Keep your hand up if you feel harder drugs play absolutely no role in the Amanda Knox case. Is there anyone here that has put up their hand all 3 times? Stay tuned because I'm going to ask you the same question again at the end of this analysis, and we're going to see whether you're going to put your hands up again, right? All right then. In the previous analysis, we heard the damning testimony of Antonio Curatolo, who claimed he saw not only Amanda Knox but Raffaele Sollecito on the night of the murders, and according to his version, he noticed Raffaele in particular apparently scoping out the villa remotely from the railing at Piazza Grimana. That testimony in 2009 ultimately led to Amanda Knox being convicted for murder. I'm not saying it's just that testimony, but that was part of what went into the successful conviction of Amanda Knox in 2009. And she was actually sentenced to over 20 years in an Italian prison, ditto Sollecito. The prosecution at the time felt that she was actually the ringleader of the 3 perpetrators. But then 2 years later, the pair appealed. 2 years later, in March 2011, Curatolo was back in court. And this is how Bobby Lazzanadao, who also wrote a book on the case, described the events as they played out in court. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you're finding this analysis worthwhile, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. And so these are Barbie's words written for the Daily Beast in 2011. Amanda Knox was also visibly nervous, almost painfully so, arriving in court with her head down and her hair tied back in a girlish ponytail. Sollecito, in what could be described as an equally girlish pink sweater, appeared more relaxed than usual, pausing to smile as Knox entered the courtroom. So Knox looks completely different in this sort of second bite at the cherry in terms of the appeal. And why was Knox so nervous? Well, because at the time that Knox was convicted, she was a convicted murderer at the time, her fate now hinged, arguably, on the testimony of a homeless dude. Bobby goes on to write, Saturday's main attraction was Antonio Toto Curatolo, a 53-year-old homeless man and self-described lifelong drug addict and anarchist. Curatolo was a key witness for the prosecution in the original trial, testifying that he saw Knox and Celeste together near the scene of the crime the night of November 1st, 2007, when Kircher was murdered. Back then, his testimony was considered dubious, and appellate judge Claudio Pratillo Hellman called him back this past, and I think it should say week or so. Of course, 2 years since her conviction, the media landscape had changed massively in terms of the Knox case. Her PR machine was up and running and humming along. Pro-Knox blogs and a number of American publications were putting cumulative pressure on the Italians. Even Donald Trump weighed in at the time, tweeting, "Everyone should boycott Italy if Amanda Knox is not freed. She is totally innocent." That was in 2011. Now, given this context, it's no surprise that Knox's appeal was a lot of theatre, pageantry, and apologia, and Barbie Nadal basically confirms that, writing the following. "It was pure theatre in the Perugia courtroom on Saturday, as Seattle native Amanda Knox and her erstwhile Italian boyfriend Raffaele Sollecito heard a decisive witness in their appeal against convictions for the 2007 murder of Meredith Kercher. As the drama played out on the stand, Knox's 10 supporters jeered and pointed, trying to intimidate journalists seated in the public viewing area. So there's something Colosseum-like about the courtroom, where Knox's supporters, presumably Americans, are in court, pointing, jeering, making kind of loud gestures, and according to Barbie, literally trying to intimidate journalists that are seated there. And they also referred to guttural growls and stern warnings to write the truth. But Knox need not have worried. In the 2 years since the prosecution's star witness had testified, he'd been convicted of drug peddling, and worse, he was clean in 2011. This is when he gave his testimony, which meant his testimony was all over the place. Back to the article in the Daily Beast. Then, without much prompting at all, Curatolo contradicted himself, describing how the night he saw Knox and Celeste, there were also people in Halloween costumes and shuttle buses taking revelers to the local discotheques. The two young people were talking intensely to each other, he told the court. In the piazza that night, young people in masks were coming and going, and buses were leaving for the nightclubs. Of course, that can't possibly be true. If Curatolo saw Knox and Celeste against the backdrop of disco buses and Halloween costumes, it wasn't the night before the murder. Instead, it had to have been 2 nights before on Halloween, even though neither Knox nor Celeste were anywhere near the basketball court that night. Now, I must say, even though I've written 6 books on the case, I've gotten confused about when this case actually happened, just given the period of time, that window that passes between when the crime was actually committed, the relevance of the Halloween party, and the discovery of the body. Now, it's hardly surprising that a heavy drug user, in this case a heroin addict, would have difficulty recalling the past. In 2011, it was events 4 years prior. And so purely on the basis of Curatolo's heavy drug use, he was able to be dismissed as a witness. Barbie goes on to write, he maintains that he did see them at the basketball court at Piazza Grimana, but by the reaction and smirks on the faces of the judges and jury, his testimony won't be considered reliable in the final analysis of this case. So you can imagine the Colosseum-like atmosphere during the appeal phase was a totally different vibe to what was going on during the first trial. Barbie goes on to write, still in what is now the standard post-hearing spin fest. Now that's another thing that had changed. Now after every hearing, there'd be like a battle of narratives going on online and in social media and in the mainstream media. And so she refers to this as a spin fest. Both sides used Curatolo's testimony to their advantage. The defense aptly pointed out that Curatolo also told the judge that he had been a lifelong drug addict. And so you have the defense rubbing their hands. Oh, this is great news. The fact that he's a drug addict means he's totally unreliable, and had used heroin regularly in 2007 when he claims to have seen Knox and Celeste. So he's using heroin. So we can just throw out that testimony. He was also likely high in 2009 when he gave his original court testimony. Great, more rubbing of hands, which might explain why he was much more lucid then than now. These are Bobby's words. When he is sober after serving time for drug peddling. For good measure, Kuratola also told the judge that heroin is not a hallucinogenic drug. The prosecution, meanwhile, said that they admitted that Kuratola was not ultimately helpful, but they also point out the fact that the murder convictions did not hinge on Kuratola's testimony. So in a way they were saying, his testimony wasn't the only thing that got Amanda Knox convicted, right? Knox's defense were correct to point out that in 2007, Kuratola was a regular heroin user, and besides that, a lifelong drug addict. And it may be true that he was high in 2009 when he gave his original testimony. And so if you're going to say, wow, I don't really think drugs plays any role in this case, you actually had a drug addict testifying to very important evidence, probably while high, on the stand. That is a real influence on this case, right? 2 years later, 2 years after that testimony, he's testifying in court. This time he's stone cold sober, and he was a lot less lucid. He couldn't remember the events. His thinking was ragged and fragmented. Now, it is interesting that Kuratola told the judge that heroin isn't a hallucinogenic drug. Now, let me ask you, do you think that's relevant? Do you think it's relevant to say, maybe I was on drugs, but, this drug doesn't make you see anything? Do you think that's relevant? What he's doing is implying that he couldn't have hallucinated what he saw, so he must have seen what he saw after all, even if he was impaired in some way. Do you think that that's relevant? Right, now let's bring all of this back to full circle. Remember I said put up your hand at the beginning? Put up your hand now if you still feel like the drug narrative is overblown in the Knox case. Let me ask you the question again. Put up your hand if you feel the drug narrative is overblown in the Knox case. Remember, if you put up your hand now, it's not in defense of Amanda Knox, but instead in defense of Antonio Kuratola. Do you want to defend him? Even though he was using hard drugs and his testimony was extremely important in both the conviction and the acquittal of Knox and Celesto. Put up your hand if you've said that there's no harm in using marijuana, and that's what this case is all about. And marijuana, the effects of marijuana are that they don't lead to violent impulses. Because if you say maybe drugs were used, but it's still irrelevant because you don't know drugs, well, heroin isn't a hallucinogenic, right? It's not a hallucinogenic drug. So should Kuratola's testimony be accepted after all? Keep your hand up if you feel harder drugs play absolutely no role in the Amanda Knox case. Now let me ask you a simple question. Did you put up your hand at the beginning, but not at the end? If so, you're applying a double standard, which is a sign of bias. By the way, I have to say, for me, this image on screen now of these evidence markers, F, G, I, J, and Y, going through the kitchen on the way to the front door, these to me, this is one of the most important crime scene photos in the entire case. Can you tell why I would say something like that? Why I'd make such an extraordinary statement? Have a look at this picture. What do you see? Now, I want to conclude by saying, if there is a lifelong drug addict, a heroin user who would be convicted for selling drugs, and he's been living in Piazza Gramana across the fucking road from the cottage, right? And he's been living there for 8 or 9 fucking years, then how the fuck can you say 17 years later that the drug narrative is completely irrelevant in this case? Or is the drug narrative relevant to everybody else, just not Amanda Knox? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.